The envelope was still sealed when Clara found it tucked beneath the counter, pressed flat under 30 years of grime and a rusted cash drawer that had not opened since before she was born. She had been standing in the dim light of the old gas station for less than 10 minutes, her termination letter still folded in the back pocket of her jeans, the ink barely dry. Her hands were shaking, not from cold, though the building was cold, the kind of cold that seeps from concrete that has been left alone too long. She was shaking because the envelope had her name on it, her full name, written in her mother's handwriting. Clara Rose Hennessy. 3 words in blue ink, careful and deliberate, like someone who had practiced the letters before committing to the page. Her mother had been dead for 11 days. Clara stood there with the envelope in her hands and the smell of old oil and dried rubber all around her, and she did not open it. She listened instead to the wind pushing through a gap in the tin roof above her, a thin metallic whistle that rose and fell. She listened to the sound of her own breathing. She had come here because there was nowhere else to go. She had not expected to find anything. She had certainly not expected to find this. The question that settled into her chest, slow and heavy as a stone dropped into still water, was simple. Her mother had known she would come here, had counted on it, had left something behind for her, specifically beneath the grime of a place that had been closed for 3 decades. What else had her mother known, and for how long? But to understand this, we have to go back to the beginning. To a Tuesday morning in early November, when Clara Hennessy was 18 years old, and the world, as she understood it, came apart at 2 separate seams before noon. She had worked at the Ridge Valley Electronics store for 14 months. It was a chain store in a mid-sized town, the kind of place that smelled of plastic packaging and floor cleaner, where the overhead lights were too bright and the uniform polo shirts itched at the collar. Clara had taken the job the summer after she finished school, partly because she needed the money and partly because her mother, Helen, had been sick for a while by then, and the hospital visits were quietly eating through what little savings they had. Clara was good at the job, better than good. She could diagnose a broken laptop from the sound of its fan, could talk an anxious grandmother through setting up a new phone with the patience of someone twice her age. Her supervisor, a thin-necked man named Derek who wore his lanyard too long and his authority too short, had told her in her 6-month review that she was one of the best he had. He had said it the way people say things they do not intend to act on. On that Tuesday in November, Clara arrived for her morning shift to find a printed notice taped to the staff room door. Restructuring, effective immediately. 14 names on the list, hers among them. No conversation, no warning. Just a list and a box of her belongings already packed by someone else, her spare charger and her bottle of hand cream sitting on top like they were items in an evidence bag. Derek was not in the building. He had sent an email. She stood in the car park for a long time after that, the cardboard box balanced on her hip, the morning traffic passing on the main road 50 meters away. A lorry changed gears. Someone's phone rang in a passing car. The sky was low and grey in the way November skies are grey, without drama, just a flat refusal of light. She drove home to tell her mother. Helen Hennessy had been living with a slow-moving lung condition for 4 years. It had taken its time with her, the way some illnesses do, circling without committing, and for long stretches of those 4 years she had been almost entirely herself. Sharp, dry-humoured, interested in everything. She kept the television on for company, but rarely watched it. She read library books and folded the corners of pages she wanted to return to. She made strong tea and left it to go cold. The house they lived in was a rented terrace on the eastern side of town. 2 bedrooms, a garden that had gone to moss and long grass, a kitchen that smelled of toast in the mornings. Clara had grown up here, in the particular intimacy of a household that had only ever been the 2 of them. Her father was a name on a birth certificate and a box of photographs her mother kept in the wardrobe but never looked at. Clara had stopped asking about him by the time she was 12. The asking had only ever produced a specific kind of silence from her mother, careful and packed tight, like a drawer that closes too easily because something heavy is resting against the back of it. When Clara came through the door that Tuesday with her cardboard box, Helen was sitting at the kitchen table. She was not reading, she was not watching anything. She was simply sitting, both hands flat on the table, and she looked up when Clara came in with the expression of someone who had been waiting. Derek's list, Clara said, setting the box on the counter. Helen nodded slowly. She did not say she was sorry. She did not say things would be all right. She got up and put the kettle on, and they sat together at the table while the tea brewed. And the silence between them was the old kind, the familiar kind, the kind that did not need to be filled. It was in that silence, with the steam rising from the mugs and the grey light through the kitchen window, that Helen said the first thing she had ever said about the gas station. She said, "When I go, that place on the Dunmore Road will be yours, the old Hennessy station." Clara had stared at her. Helen had looked at her mug. "Your grandfather built it. Your grandmother ran it. It belongs to you. I've made sure of that." And then she had changed the subject, as cleanly as turning a page. Clara had asked questions. Of course she had, but Helen had retreated behind that packed tight silence, and within a week she had been admitted to the hospital for what would turn out to be the last time. The gas station was not mentioned again. Not by Helen, not in the paperwork that Clara had spent the 11 days since her mother's death trying to understand. The will and the title deeds, and the council notices and the solicitor's letters, all of it in a language that felt designed to exhaust the person reading it. The station sat on the Dunmore Road, 3 miles outside of town. Clara had driven past it 100 times without registering it. It was the kind of building that disappears into its own neglect. A low structure set back from the road, with 2 rusted fuel pumps out front and a small service bay attached to the right-hand side. The forecourt was cracked concrete, weeds pushing through every seam. The sign above the door, Hennessy and Son, had lost its S and its ampersand to rust and weather, so that it now read simply Hennessy on, which Clara thought the first time she stood in front of it was either a small tragedy or a small instruction. She had arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, 11 days after her mother's death, the termination notice in her pocket because she had not known where else to put it. The solicitor had handed her the key that morning. A large flat key on a ring with a plastic tag, and on the plastic tag someone had written the address in faded blue ink. Blue ink. The same blue ink as the envelope beneath the counter. She had not made the connection immediately. She had been too caught up in the physical reality of the place. The smell of it, first of all, the thick, particular smell of a space that has been sealed against the weather for decades, old petroleum and dust, and something sweet underneath that she could not identify, like dried wood or stored paper or the memory of other people's summers. The light was poor. The windows had been covered on the inside with newspaper, which had yellowed and curled at the edges, the headlines indecipherable with age. She had walked behind the counter because it was the first place she looked. Behind counters was where things lived, cash drawers, notebooks, the accumulated small evidence of working days. The counter itself was wood, painted green once, the paint now peeling in long strips. She had pressed both hands flat on its surface, the way her mother had pressed her hands flat on the kitchen table that Tuesday morning, and felt the texture of it, the ridged paint and the smooth wood beneath. Then her eyes had adjusted to the dimness, and she had seen the cash drawer, and she had lifted it, half to see if it was stuck, and found the envelope. Clara Rose Hennessy. 3 words in blue ink. She carried the envelope outside and sat on the concrete step in front of the station door. The afternoon light was thin and cold. Across the road, a stand of bare birch trees made a scratching sound against the wind. She turned the envelope over in her hands twice, then slid her finger beneath the flap. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper, and folded inside that sheet were 2 things. A photograph and a smaller envelope, much older, its own seal long since broken and resealed, with a strip of tape that had dried to amber. Her mother's letter was short. 3 paragraphs, written on both sides of one sheet, in the same careful blue ink. Helen Hennessy had never been a woman who wasted words on paper. The letter reflected this. The first paragraph said that she was sorry she had not told Clara more while there was time, but that she had needed to be sure the station would pass to Clara before she said anything, and the legal business had taken longer than expected. The second paragraph said that the photograph was taken in 1987, and that the man standing next to Clara's grandmother at the fuel pumps was not Clara's grandfather, as Clara might assume, but her father. His name was written on the back. Clara turned the photograph over before she finished reading the letter. The name on the back read Edmund Vale. She sat with that for a moment, The birch trees scratched at the wind. A car passed on the Dunmore Road without slowing, its engine a rising and falling note. Edmund Vale, a name she had never heard, a name her mother had carried for 18 years and placed under a counter in a sealed envelope, waiting. The third paragraph of Helen's letter said, "The smaller envelope was given to me by your grandmother the week she died. She told me to open it only when I found the right moment, and I never found it. And now I am leaving that to you. I believe you will know what to do. I believe you always have." The letter ended there, no closing, no love, just the belief left on the page and the amber-taped envelope still unread in Clara's hands. She did not open it then. She folded everything carefully back into its nested order, the small envelope inside the photograph, inside the letter, inside the outer envelope, and she put it in the chest pocket of her coat, against her breastbone, and she sat on the concrete step for a long while as the light faded at the edges of the afternoon. She came back the next morning with a torch and a stiff bristled brush and a thermos of strong tea, because those were the things she thought to bring. She also brought a notebook, a spiral-bound one from the newsagent, though she was not sure yet what she intended to write in it. The station had 3 main sections: the front service area, where the counter stood, with a small glass display case running along one wall that had once held motor oil and windscreen wash, and the small practical things people need when their cars fail them. A back room, windowless, that had served as both an office and a storage space, and the service bay, which connected through a heavy door to the right side of the building. She started at the counter and worked outward. The glass case still held things: a row of oil cans, their labels browned but legible, a box of fuses, a tin of boiled sweets, sealed, the foil unbroken. She lifted the tin and shook it gently and heard the rattle of sweets inside, and the sound was so ordinary, so domestic in the particular silence of the abandoned place, that it stopped her for a moment. Someone had put those sweets there. Someone had expected to sell them. On the shelf behind the counter, wrapped in a piece of cloth that had once been part of a curtain, she found a ledger. A proper accounts ledger, cloth-covered and fat with pages. She set it on the counter and opened it carefully because the spine was dry and she could feel the fragility of it in her hands. The earliest entries were dated 1961. The handwriting in the first 30 or 40 pages was angular and firm. A man's hand, she guessed, though she could not have said why. Then, around 1968, the handwriting changed. Rounder, more deliberate, each number formed with extra care. A woman who had been taught to be precise, Clara's grandmother. It had to be. She turned the pages slowly, watching the decades pass in columns of figures. Gallons of fuel, parts invoices, the names of regular customers, noted in a margin column with a shorthand she could not entirely decode. An asterisk next to some names, a small circle next to others. She turned to the back of the ledger and found a page that was different from the rest. The columns had been abandoned. In their place was a list, written vertically down the page in the same careful round hand, and the list was of names. 23 names. She recognized none of them except the last one. The last one was Helen Hennessy. Clara's finger rested on the name. The ledger was cold under her hands, the pages faintly damp at the edges. Outside, a lorry passed on the Dunmore Road and the windows rattled in their frames. She photographed the page with her phone, then she closed the ledger and wrapped it back in its curtain cloth and set it carefully in the cardboard box she had brought for things she wanted to take. She made her way to the back room. The smell here was different, heavier, more enclosed, the particular mustiness of paper stored against damp. There was a metal filing cabinet against the far wall, its surface spotted with rust. She tried the top drawer, and it opened with a grinding protest, and inside were files, hanging files in cardboard folders, the paper inside them desiccated and slightly brittle. She pulled the first folder. Bank statements. The account holder was listed as Hennessy and Son Fuels, the statements running from 1971 to 1983. She flipped through them without reading the details, noting only that the balances were modest but present, the business alive in its numbers, then thinning, the deposits growing less frequent toward the end. She pulled a second folder. Correspondence. Letters in and out, the outgoing ones carbons on pale blue paper. She scanned them. supplier disputes, a planning application, a letter from a solicitor whose firm name she did not recognize, and near the back of the folder a bundle of letters held together with a rubber band so old it crumbled when she touched it. The letters fell loose. She gathered them from the floor of the cabinet drawer and counted 7. All 7 were addressed to her grandmother, Margaret Hennessy. The return address on each one was a town 2 counties north. The handwriting was unhurried, educated, the handwriting of someone who had gone to a school that still taught penmanship as a discipline. She sat on the dusty floor of the back room with the torch propped against the cabinet and read the first letter, then the second. By the third, she had stopped breathing normally. The letters were from a man named Edward Vale. The name on the back of the photograph was Edmund Vale. The family resemblance between the 2 names, the slight variation, the same surname, sat in her chest like a note held too long. She turned the third letter over. The date was September 1969. The tone was the tone of someone who had been refused something they considered theirs. "Your decision," Edward Vale wrote, "does not change what was agreed. The station was collateral. You know this. I have the document." She read it 3 times. Then she stood up, put the torch between her teeth, and searched every remaining folder in the cabinet. It was in the bottom drawer. A single sheet of paper in a manila envelope. The envelope sealed with a rubber stamp impression that had faded to near illegibility. She held the torch close. An agreement. A loan. Dated 1963, the loan was from Edward Vale to Hennessy and Son Fuels, the borrower listed as one Patrick Hennessy. The amount was substantial for 1963. The collateral listed was the station property and the land on which it stood. And in the margin of the document, in a different hand, someone had written 3 words. Paid in full, with a date, 14th of March 1971, and a signature she could not read. The service bay, she found, had its own secrets. She came back to the station on the 3rd day with better tools, a pry bar she had borrowed from a neighbor, a tarpaulin for kneeling, a better torch. The heavy door between the front room and the bay was swollen in its frame and needed the pry bar to persuade it open. The smell that came through when it finally gave was the sharpest thing she had encountered yet, raw oil and cold metal and something underneath. Something she identified after a moment as leather. Old leather, the kind that has dried beyond softening. The bay was a single large space with a vehicle pit in the center, the pit covered with 2 planks of wood that bowed slightly under their own age. Tools hung on the far wall on a pegboard system, most of them still in their places, as if whoever had last used them had simply replaced them carefully and walked away. A socket wrench, a set of ring spanners, a pair of grips so large they looked ceremonial, and parked in the corner, covered by a canvas sheet that had gone grey with dust, was a car. She pulled the sheet from the front corner and it slid with a heavy whoomp to the floor, releasing a cloud of dust that she breathed in before she could stop herself and coughed into her sleeve for 20 seconds. The car was a 1964 Rover, dark green, now furred with the pale residue of decades in an enclosed space. She walked around it slowly. The tires were flat, sunken into themselves, the rubber cracked. The chrome of the front grille had corroded to a dull copper shade. But the bodywork, beneath the grime, was intact. No rust had come for the panels. Someone had prepared it for storage. Someone had cared for it before they left it. On the back seat, visible through the window, was a box. She tried the door handle, locked. She tried the other rear door, also locked. She considered the situation. The keys to the car were not on the key ring the solicitor had given her. She went back to the front room and looked behind the counter again, more carefully this time, running her hands along surfaces she had only glanced at before. She found them on a nail behind the side panel of the counter, 3 keys on a plain ring, 1 ignition key, 2 smaller ones. The rear door opened on the second try. The box on the back seat was a wooden tea chest, old, with the words Ceylon Export printed on the side in faded stencil. She lifted the lid. Inside, packed in layers of old newspaper, were objects. She lifted the newspaper from the first layer. A christening cup, silver engraved. The name on it was Margaret Rose. A set of letters, bound in ribbon. A different hand from the Vale letters, warmer and more compressed. A child's shoe, single brown leather with a small buckle. The buckle was the green of oxidized copper, and beneath all of it, wrapped in a piece of blue cotton cloth, a second ledger, smaller than the one from the counter, more worn. She opened it and found that this one was not an accounts ledger at all. The pages were undated. The handwriting was the careful round hand of her grandmother. This one was a diary. Clara sat in the back seat of the 1964 Rover with the small ledger in her lap and the thin November light coming through the grime of the bay's single high window, and she read. Margaret Hennessy had been a woman with precise thoughts and the ability to set them down without flourish. The diary did not begin with confessions or explanations. It began with the particular detail of a Tuesday in 1959, the year she and Patrick had bought the station. We drove out to see it in the evening, Margaret had written. The light was behind it, and Patrick had to shade his eyes with his hand to read the sign. He said, "That will say Hennessy soon enough." I believed him. I believe most things he says. This is not stupidity. It is the considered decision of a woman who has studied her man over 11 years of marriage. Clara turned the pages carefully, a month of entries, then 2 months skipped, then more entries. The diary covered 4 years, with gaps of weeks and sometimes months that she began to understand were not forgetting but deliberate, the recording of only those things worth recording. Edward Vale appeared in the entries in late 1963 with the loan. Margaret had written, Patrick came home pleased with himself in the manner of a man who has solved a problem but not yet considered whether the solution was wise. The money from Vale will repair the pumps and extend the bay. I asked what Vale receives. Patrick said, his money back in 5 years, with interest. I asked what if we are slow. Patrick did not answer. A year later, slow year. The pump's receipts are down. Patrick is not worried. I am worried enough for both of us. 2 years after that, paid the Vale balance in full. I drove to the solicitor myself and had it witnessed. Patrick did not want to go. He said it was enough to pay. I said it is not enough. The document must show it. He came in the end. Edward Vale's face when the solicitor stamped the paper was the face of a man who had expected the day to go differently. Clara stopped reading. Paid in full. Witnessed. 14th of March 1971, the margin note on the agreement in the cabinet drawer. Her grandmother's signature. She understood now what the margin note was. Her grandmother had gone to the trouble of marking the original agreement. She had created evidence, carefully and deliberately, that the loan had been repaid, because she had known that someone, someday, might come looking, might try to claim the station under the terms of a collateral agreement that no longer applied. She turned more pages. The entry from August 1971 read, "A letter from Vale today. Patrick doesn't know. I have put it in the files. He will try again, I think. Men of that kind always try again. But the document is safe. The station is ours." And then near the back of the diary, in an entry from 1977, I have written down everything that needs to be known about this place. The loan, the repayment, the name that must not be forgotten, Hennessy. It does not belong to the Vales, no matter what Edward tells his son. It never did. And when I am gone, whoever carries this name will need to know that. Clara read that last line 3 times. Whoever carries this name will need to know that. Her grandmother had died in 1989, 2 years after the photograph was taken. The photograph in which a man named Edmund Vale stood at the Hennessy fuel pumps with a proprietary ease, his hand resting on the pump handle as if it were his. Edmund Vale, Edward Vale's son, her father. She sat with that knowledge in the cold of the service bay, the diary in her lap, the smell of old leather and oil around her. She sat with it for a long time. The afternoon light through the high window shifted as the sun moved, and eventually the bay began to darken at the edges, and still she sat. Her breath made small clouds in the cold air. The 1964 Rover held her weight without complaint. The springs soft with age, the back seat giving slightly beneath her. She thought about her mother, pressing both hands flat on the kitchen table. She thought about the envelope left beneath the counter, her name in careful blue ink. She thought about a 14-year-old girl who had been taught by a careful woman to form each number with extra precision, and who had grown up to drive to a solicitor's office and stamp an agreement and mark 3 words in the margin, paid in full. She thought about the child's shoe at the bottom of the tea chest. A single shoe, not a pair. She reached back into the box and lifted the shoe out carefully. Brown leather, the small copper buckle. She turned it over and looked at the sole, and in the leather of the inner sole, stamped in ink that had faded but not entirely gone, were the initials HMH, Helen Margaret Hennessy, her mother's shoe. And it was here, in the cold and the smell of oil, with one small shoe in her hands, that Clara understood the full length of what had been passed to her. Her grandmother had kept this, had put it in a box in a car that was stored and covered and locked in a bay that was sealed and left, had put beside it the evidence of a station paid for and fought for, had left it all for her daughter, who had died before she could pass it on, and had left it a second time, through a letter under a counter, for her daughter's daughter, who had arrived at this place with nothing but a termination notice in her pocket and a key on a plastic tag. If you have made it this far in Clara's story, you understand now what she was carrying. Press subscribe so you are here when the next story begins. She did not wait to act. That was the thing about Clara, the quality that her supervisor Derek had noted and done nothing with. She identified what needed to be done, and she did it. She drove to the solicitor's office the next morning with the agreement from the filing cabinet, the diary, and the letters from Edward Vale. She also brought the ledger from the counter with its final page of names, the photograph, and her grandmother's letter in the amber-taped envelope, which she had finally opened the previous night. The letter from Margaret Hennessy to her daughter had been written in 1987, the same year as the photograph. It was 2 pages long. It laid out, in the careful round hand that Clara now recognized as clearly as her own, the complete history of the station, the loan, the repayment, the attempts by Edward Vale and subsequently his son Edmund to claim or acquire the property after Margaret had refused to sell, the agreement they had tried to use and why it could no longer be used. And it laid out one more thing. Edmund Vale had not simply been a man who stood at the pumps in 1987. He had been, for 2 years before that photograph was taken, Helen Hennessy's companion. Her mother had told her grandmother this. Margaret had written about it with the controlled precision of a woman managing her feelings carefully. "I told Helen what I know of his family," Margaret had written. "I told her the history of this place and what the Vales attempted. I do not believe she will listen. She loves him, and love of that kind does not hear the voice of history. But I have made sure the station is protected, regardless of what she chooses. The deeds are in order. The repayment is recorded. Whatever Edmund Vale tells her about what this property owes his family, the documents tell a different story, and documents outlast charm." Clara set the letters on the solicitor's desk. The solicitor's name was Patricia. She was in her 50s, with reading glasses pushed up on her head and a manner that was efficient without being cold. She had handled Helen's estate and had met Clara twice during the probate process. She looked at the documents Clara brought with the focused attention of someone who understood their implications immediately. She said nothing for several minutes while she read. Then she said, "Do you know where Edmund Vale is now?" Clara said she did not. Patricia made a note. She looked at the margin notation on the loan agreement. She looked at the solicitor's stamp, the date, the signature. She said, "This is your station. There is no question about that." Whoever might have tried to suggest otherwise at any point in the last 30 years had no legal basis. This document proves the collateral claim was discharged. Clara said, "Someone has been suggesting otherwise." Patricia looked at her. Clara showed her the last page of the ledger, the 23 names. Patricia was quiet for a moment. "Do you know what this list is?" Clara said she thought it might be a list of the people her grandmother had told, witnesses to the history, a network of local memory. Patricia looked at her with an expression that shifted from careful to something warmer. "I think you may be right." The day after that meeting, Clara drove back to the station and spent 4 hours in the service bay with a bucket of warm water and a cloth. She did not try to clean the Rover properly. She did not have the tools or the knowledge for that kind of work. She simply cleaned the windows on the inside and the outside so that light could come through them, and she lifted the planks from the vehicle pit and set them against the wall, and she opened the bay's main roller door for the first time in what must have been 3 decades. The cold outside air came in, and with it a shaft of morning light that moved across the floor as she watched, travelling over the oil-stained concrete and arriving at the side of the green car as if it had been planned. A woman appeared in the open doorway of the bay. She was perhaps 70, with white hair cut short and a wax jacket, and the particular bearing of someone who has been walking the same roads for a very long time. She stood in the doorway and looked at Clara and at the car and at the open bay and said nothing at first. Then she said, "Your grandmother's Rover." Clara said, "Yes." The woman said, "I was on that list, you know, at the back of the ledger." Clara looked at her. "Margaret asked me to remember," the woman said. "Just remember," she said, "in case it ever needs to be said out loud." So I remembered. She looked at the car again. She was a careful woman, careful about what she kept and careful about who she trusted. Her name was Frances. She had grown up on the road half a mile north of the station. She had known Margaret Hennessy for 30 years, had bought petrol here for 20 of them, had been one of the last customers before the station closed. She came in and sat in a folding chair Clara brought from the back room, and she drank the thermos tea without being asked because the cold had found its way under her jacket on the walk. Frances told Clara what she remembered of Margaret, the way she kept the accounts, the way she had managed the station alone for years after Patrick's health declined, working the pumps herself in her 60s with a competence that neither surprised anyone who knew her nor earned any particular acknowledgement from those who did not. The way she had fought, quietly and without drama, to keep the place. Vales came twice while she was still here, Frances said, once with a letter, once with Edmund, who was maybe 30 then. She told them both times that the matter was settled. She said it the same way she said everything, not loudly, but clearly enough that you would not need to be told twice. Clara said, "But someone needed to be told twice." Frances held her cup in both hands and looked at the green car. Edmund Vale came back around 1985 or so. Different approach. Started making himself known in town. Pleasant. Charming, some said. She paused. "He met your mother at some point in there." "I know. Margaret knew too. I don't think Helen knew the whole of it, about his family's interest in this place." "She knew eventually," Clara said. "By the time my mother wrote to me, she knew." Frances was quiet for a moment. Did it end badly? Clara thought about that Tuesday morning in November, the cardboard box on the counter, her mother's hands flat on the table. "I think she made a decision and lived with it," she said, "and then she died without having time to explain it properly. She left you the station. She left me everything my grandmother intended to leave her." Frances set her cup down on the concrete floor. She looked at Clara with steady eyes. "What are you going to do with it?" Clara looked around the bay, at the tools on the pegboard, at the vehicle pit, at the old car catching the morning light. She said, "I'm going to think about it for a while, and then I'm going to decide." She spent 3 weeks thinking about it, which meant 3 weeks of driving to the station every morning with the thermos and the notebook, working through the building in sections. She cleaned and catalogued and photographed. She learned the layout of the structure and the condition of the roof and the state of the plumbing. She had conversations with a builder who walked through with her and gave her a measured, undramatic assessment. She called Frances twice, not for information, but because Frances knew the history of the road and the surrounding area in the specific way that only long residence produces. She also found Edmund Vale. He was living 2 counties north, the same town whose address had appeared on Edward Vale's letters. She found him through the kind of methodical patience that had made her good at the electronics job, following threads of public information, company registrations, a planning application from 6 years ago. He was 63. He ran a property consultancy. She did not contact him directly. She gave his address to Patricia instead, along with a note of her intentions. Patricia sent him a letter. The letter contained a copy of the loan agreement with its margin notation, a copy of the solicitor's stamp from 1971, a brief summary of the documentary evidence in Clara's possession, and a clear, measured statement that the property at Dunmore Road was held in legal title by Clara Rose Hennessy, that any historical claim against it had been discharged and recorded, and that no further inquiry on this matter was anticipated. Edmund Vale's response arrived 2 weeks later. A single paragraph. He did not contest the claim. He did not apologize. He did not acknowledge the history. He simply wrote that he considered the matter closed. Patricia called Clara and read it to her over the phone. Clara said, "All right." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "Is that enough for you?" Clara thought about her grandmother driving to the solicitor's office in 1971 with the document and the witness. Thought about the 3 words in the margin. Thought about her mother keeping the small envelope sealed for years, keeping the name unspoken, carrying the whole history of it in the careful silence of someone who had been taught, perhaps, that some things are protected by not being said aloud. She said, "I think it was always going to end without a scene. Some things do." Patricia said she thought that was right. It was 4 months later that Clara opened the station. Not as a gas station. The fuel infrastructure was 40 years out of service, and the cost of rehabilitating it would have swallowed more money than she had. She opened the service bay. She had found someone to help with the Rover. A man named George who restored old vehicles as a retirement occupation and who had looked at the car with the reverent attention of someone encountering a well-behaved old friend. He had come 3 days a week for 6 weeks, and she had watched and asked questions and occasionally handed him things. The Rover ran by the end of November. Not well and not far, but under its own power, the engine turning over with a sound that was more alive than she had expected. She parked it in front of the station, facing the road. The service bay became a workshop. She started small, diagnostics, small repairs, the kind of work that required patience and the ability to listen to what a piece of machinery was actually saying beneath whatever it appeared to be doing. She had business cards printed with the address and her name and the words Hennessy Service. She put a notice in the window that faced the road. Francis came on the first day and stayed for an hour and drank tea in the folding chair. She said, "Your grandmother would have liked this." Clara said, "I didn't know her." "No, but you're using things she left you in the way she intended them to be used." Clara set her mug down on the counter, the same green-painted counter, the paint peeling in the same long strips, the same surface she had pressed her hands against 4 months ago when she first came in. She did not intend to repaint it. On a Tuesday morning in early March, she found herself standing at the fuel pumps. She was not doing anything particular with them. She had a cloth in her hand, and she was cleaning the chrome of the old pump housing, which had no function anymore but was part of the face of the building and deserved attention. The morning was cold. The birch trees across the road were beginning to show the first pale suggestions of new growth. A lorry changed gears coming up the hill. Somewhere to the south, a crow called twice and was quiet. She was 18 years old with a termination letter 4 months behind her, and a name on a building above her head and a key in her pocket. And she was cleaning chrome with a cloth in the cold morning. She thought about the day Derek had pinned the list to the staff room door, the cardboard box with her hand cream on top. She thought about how she had stood in the car park with the traffic going past, the way a person stands when they have come loose from the thing they were attached to and have not yet understood that they were attached to the wrong thing. She thought about her mother getting up from the kitchen table to put the kettle on. The way she had simply moved, without consolation, without dramatic speech, just the small practical gesture of a woman who understood that the thing to do in a difficult moment is make the next cup of tea and then the one after that. She had not known that Tuesday what her mother intended to say to her later. She had not known about the station, or the key, or the envelope beneath the counter. She had not known that the thing she was being pushed away from was only clearing space for what was already hers,